BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And just a quick reminder, every Monday is Zodiac Mondays. Wednesday is an Ask Me Anything. That's an AMA, so please drop your questions below for things that you would like discussed here on the show. And Friday is an Anything Goes. Any subject is fair game, mostly talking about true crime, serial killers, the Zodiac Killer, but any subject is welcome. All right, so please share some ideas in the comment section about what you would like to hear about on this channel, and let's get started. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Tuesday, time for some true crime talk radio. And before we begin, I would like to drop a very quick announcement to anybody who is following these discussions as they come out live. There will be an AMA on Wednesday and Ask Me Anything, but it will be all about some of the Zodiac Killer communications that happened after the 1980s. It really is quite shocking that the Zodiac crimes stopped in 1969 officially, but the communications went on for God only knows how long. So if you haven't hit that like button and subscribed yet, now's a great time to do so you can follow along with all of these. And another great way to support the channel is to go over to Amazon.com and have a look at my book, Killer on a White Horse, by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel murder mystery inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is fictional. But who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the Teespring page. Feel free to have a look at some of the merchandise, and remember, being weird is not a crime. About a week ago, I did an episode on JonBenet Ramsey, who was the victim in perhaps one of the most famous murder cases in the last 30 years here in America. And JonBenet was murdered inside her own home in Boulder, Colorado, and even though I did an episode close to the anniversary, I was unaware that it was indeed the 25th anniversary that has just passed, and that was in 2021. Now we are in the new year, 2022. JonBenet was strangled with a garrote, a makeshift garrote of sorts, which perhaps isn't even the appropriate term, but there is a piece of a broken paintbrush that has a rope tied around it in somewhat of a twisted knot, and that she was hit over the head with a blunt object, and there were 2 puncture marks on her body that some people thought were a stun gun. Some people thought that it was a piece of a toy train track, like from a train track set. And what happened to JonBenet, it is still a mystery. But there really is a very big divide in the true crime research world. Some people think that it was someone within her own family, meaning her brother Burke, her mother Patsy, or her father John Ramsey, and some people think that that is just absolutely not true. These people were the victims of a horrible, horrible tragedy. She was murdered by an intruder. In the previous episode, I looked at Burke as a suspect whom I have not thought very highly of in the past, and the episode was simply called Did Burke Ramsey Murder JonBenet?, which I invite you to listen to. But I wanted to talk about a different suspect that I was very curious about in the past, and his name is Michael Helgoth, because, as I said, I was very highly thinking of him. I thought that he was a suspect who was heavily overlooked by the majority of the mainstream media, and I'll get into that later on in the episode. But first, Playtime recommended a documentary to me called Who Killed the Pageant Queen, which was available here on YouTube for free. It was done in multiple 15-minute parts, but the whole thing was available on YouTube. And after watching that one, again, it does heavily vilify Michael Helgoth as a suspect in JonBenet's murder, but they actually left out a lot of very critical information, and I also have to thank Tina L. for providing me with some new images for BBOR, as well as just some additional sources about how these documentaries do not always share all of the facts. And the first is, who is this guy Michael Helgoth? He worked in a junkyard on the outskirts of Boulder, Colorado, and Aphrodite Jones did an episode about him ages ago, talking about how he had a property dispute with the Ramseys, and that his boot print was found at the scene of the crime near JonBenet's body. JonBenet was found in the basement of their Colorado home. And even though I said I thought highly of him as a suspect, I simply did not truly comprehend how the theory would have operated. Why would this junkyard employee, maybe co-owner, have a motive to go after JonBenet Ramsey? And as I said in the past, I mean, I thought they found some damning evidence against him, but I didn't fully comprehend it. Okay, the theory would go like this. There are at least two men, Michael Helgoth and an unidentified male. The documentary Who Killed the Pageant Queen actually did say they knew the name of the suspect. They just did not want to reveal it because he had never been formally charged with the crimes. They found some similar criminal activity that they thought was connected, and they had a suspect, but again, they did not reveal his name. But point number one, these two guys were supposed to cash in on a very big piece of business, and they were both set to earn between 50, 55, maybe almost $60,000 apiece. And that business deal fell through. Yet, some way, somehow, they learned about John Ramsey's annual bonus. John Ramsey worked for that, what was it, Access Graphics? I always mess it up. Sometimes I say Allied Graphics. He has lots of money, right? And he also gets an annual bonus of $118,000. They learned about that bonus, and that was mentioned in the ransom note, that there was going to be a ransom of $118,000. This would have been a way that they could have tried to get back the money that they would have lost on this deal out of frustration. And in the commotion, JonBenet was murdered, and then they just took off and fled the scene. They realized, oh crap, she's dead. And then they hightailed it out of there, and they left her body behind. I'll share some things about the ransom note later on, how about there could be a twofold purpose for that. Alright, then they did a press conference talking about zeroing in on a suspect, and shortly after the press conference, Michael Helgoth committed suicide. Now, both the Aphrodite Jones program and Who Killed the Pageant Queen looked very closely at, the possibility that Michael Helgoth did not indeed commit suicide, and that he was murdered by this other male accomplice. And the reasons they say that is he died from a gunshot wound to his left side, meaning that he would have had to have held the gun with his left hand, but he was right-handed, and he was shot in the midsection, like between the in the torso area, more or less. And most people commit suicide by a gunshot wound to the head if they're going to do so. However, I always thought that was a very poor explanation about those doubters. And they also say that he held a pillow against his stomach, or his chest, torso, midsection, as a way to muffle the sound. They think that is also significant of murder rather than suicide. So they think that he wanted money, but the abduction failed, and they abandoned her body. He took off. He was very paranoid, and then he was also had some history of mental instability, firing guns at people at very bizarre times. And they said that he was somewhat of a very, not exactly inappropriate, but more just like unpredictable individual when it came to deviant behavior. But then he ends up dead. Whether it's a murder or a suicide, there are these two male intruders. Yeah, this documentary really did leave out a lot of info, and I was discussing this, as I said, with Tina, who provided just somewhat of a counter response by saying, point number one, that their case against Michael Helgoth really hinges upon matching his boot print to the crime scene. And they say that near JonBenet's body, there was a high-tech boot print with the letters HITEC. It's written on the sole of the boot, and it's imprinted near where her body was found. Michael Helgoth did indeed own a pair of high-tech boots, and you watch this documentary, Who Killed the Pageant Queen? Yeah, it makes him look pretty damn guilty. They're like Not only do they match the boot print of the crime scene, there is microbiological evidence that is contained in the soil samples in his boot that is found at the crime scene. By microbiological evidence, they mean a very particular type of algae in the soil that is compressed in the boot is found in both places. But even after doing some quick Google searches, you can see very clearly that the language gets fuzzy. At first they say, okay, he owned a similar pair of boots, and I was just like instantly, nope, that's not it. If they're saying it's similar, that means it's not the same. And the second point is, his boot print was the wrong size. So I don't know why they choose to leave out these facts. And there was another comment that came in from Tina L, who said, sometimes these media players just want to make the case seem more mysterious to cash in on. But there's another flaw, though, that is one of my own original observations, and that is that they think that Michael Helgoth was murdered by this male accomplice, who was actually the person who would have killed JonBenet, because, for some reasons, but then this male accomplice went on to go after another girl in a different family, and that was another botched attempted abduction, and that failed, and he got away. But the only reason they suspect him in that one is that the attempted abductor, was wearing all black, was seen by witnesses, and their unidentified person of interest also frequently wore all black, and people would say, oh yeah, he wore all black all the time and put his hood up and he dressed like a ninja. Well, I'm just reminded of something that I heard on the Lord and Arts channel when someone was trying to just bring about that as a suspect. Someone followed me wearing a hood for 30 minutes, and they're talking about walking on a city street, and the host of that program, John Lorton, simply said, why on earth did you include that in evidence that somebody was wearing a hood, and like they had a hooded sweatshirt and they had their hood up and they're walking on a city street? Like, why is that evidence? Well, and I would just ask them back this Who Killed the Pageant Queen documentary. What's your point? Someone committed a home invasion and they wore all black? Well, what color should they wear? Turquoise? Maybe something like tangerine? Of course, I think you guys can get the idea. I don't think that requires any more explanation. But what I thought was more problematic for this theory is that, number one, this unidentified person of interest, would no longer be doing this for financial motive. Instead, it would be about some type of frequent sexually motivated behavior. I mean, if he's just going after vulnerable little girls and such, and he's breaking into people's homes to abduct women. I mean, did this family also have $118,000? Doesn't look like it. So that is another particular point that is very inconsistent. They're saying they went after JonBenet for money. Oh yeah, but he also goes after other girls for a sexual motive. I think that that's horribly inconsistent. But we had a comment that came in on that last episode about did Burke Ramsey murder JonBenet? And it came from Rob S., who said, why don't I talk about the theories of Lou Smith? Lou Smith has since passed away, and Lou Smith was perhaps one of the more famous investigators in the case, and he was a very large proponent of an intruder theory. Maybe you've even seen the video when he gives a possible recreation about how an intruder could have broken into the Ramsey home. And Lou Smith was featured in Who Killed the Pageant Queen, and he said very clearly something else that I thought was, well, just very unexpected. I mean, this is Lou Smith in his own words. He said that he believed that JonBenet was struck in the head after she had been strangled because there was no swelling in her brain. If she had been struck in the head first, then there would have been swelling in the brain. And Tina provided me a quotation from the pathologist and the medical examiner that said something absolutely to the contrary. The presence of cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, suggested that JonBenet had survived for some period of time after receiving the blow to her head. Blood from the injury slowly began to fill the cavity in her skull and began to build up pressure. As the pressure increased, the swelling was caused was causing the medulla of the brain to push through the foramen magnum, the narrow opening at the base of her skull. Now, it's important to remember, JonBenet was killed because of strangulation, because of that garrote-like piece of rope and the broken piece of Patsy's paintbrush. But she would have died anyway from the head wound, more or less is what the conclusion of that medical examiner. I just thought it was odd that someone like Lou Smith would say something that is in direct contrast. Now, he wasn't a doctor, but, I mean, some people think that it was because he was on the side of the Ramseys and he is just spreading disinfo. But what I thought was more interesting was that Lou Smith, as I said, has passed away, but his granddaughters are actually continuing the tradition. They're continuing his work, and they want to do something in honor of their grandfather, and they do a podcast. They talk about JonBenet, and they said something, though, that did indeed make a lot of sense to me. Not about Michael Helgoth, not about this unidentified man who likes to wear black all the time, and you gotta have a lot better evidence than that. But they simply said, though, to anybody who thinks that one of the Ramseys killed JonBenet, what's the story? Somebody got a ding on the head that was too hard, and the family came up with a perverted way to cover it up. That's the family member theory, that somebody just hit JonBenet with too much force, and then they thought of this twisted and borderline maniacal, indeed maniacal way of staging the scene. Now, what's the alternative? It was an intruder, and even though it doesn't seem like that comment about the swelling in the brain helps Lou Smith's credibility, then still it seems that there's just always these problems with finding an explanation about how and why the family members would have staged the scene. I will provide you with one alternative to this whole, okay, it's a ding on the head and the family member came up with a perverted way to cover it up. As I said, there is a larger theory that John Ramsey's company had connections to Lockheed Martin, and that JonBenet was actually murdered by a high-ranking executive for that company. And I don't even want to say too much about that because, again, accusing people of murder and such when they, again, haven't been charged with this and they aren't even formal suspects. These are more or less people running their mouths on the internet. But that a very high-ranking executive was involved with this, and this is all just the regular activities of the rich and powerful people. A lot of deviant sex acts happen behind closed doors, meaning that John and Patsy knew exactly who murdered JonBenet, and they simply covered up because, well, they would have been ruined, possibly murdered, if they revealed, and they might have even been turning a blind eye to it, because, again, that's how John Ramsey would have made his fortune, by cutting deals with people who do very deviant things behind closed doors. But there's some people out there who just simply think that if there are people in elite circles, they're also sex maniacs. And I think we'll leave it at that. After watching the documentary Who Killed the Pageant Queen, I also saw the one on ABC, which was done in an absolutely different fashion. Instead of trying to vilify Michael Helgoth or an intruder, they looked at the Ramseys, and they point out all of the odd and inconsistent behavior with John and Patsy Ramsey. Patsy Ramsey is wearing the same clothes the night JonBenet was murdered as the morning when she has quote-unquote been disappeared. They point out the similarities in her handwriting, and it's not only the clothing, actually. She is also wearing her makeup, meaning that she did not take it off. That suggests that she was awake during the entirety of the night, and that John Ramsey also was very odd in his behavior when he met with the first responding officer, Linda Arndt, the woman who spent the majority of time with the Ramseys, trying to quote-unquote patrol the house and keep everyone in a concentrated area. John Ramsey is also the person who found the body. He moved JonBenet's body, and I've read in the past that Linda Arndt allowed him to do this, but they didn't seem to zone in on that exact detail, but she allowed him to put a white blanket over JonBenet's body after she was dead. I mean, they made it seem more like John Ramsey just did that himself, meaning that the whole crime scene was absolutely contaminated, that fiber A could have gone from the blanket onto JonBenet's body. All of these explanations about why the evidence would be messed up. Or we should also bear in mind that JonBenet was indeed sexually assaulted. And there is a particular point in their presentation that stood out to me, and that is the behavior of Patsy Ramsey. What's my favorite saying? Being weird is not a crime. However, Patsy Ramsey's weird behavior does her no favors, and I know she has passed away as well, but she doesn't always answer the questions immediately. And maybe you've heard the famous clip where she just says, "I don't give a flying flip." And then, like, they're accusing her of murdering her own daughter, and she says, "He's like, you're going down the wrong path." And Patsy Ramsey was a West Virginian. I am a West Virginian. And part of me thinks that this is indeed just very weird West Virginian humor. And some people who move from outside states to West Virginia even talk about this, about how West Virginians kind of say things in a bizarre way, or the humor is much darker, or it's indirect. Patsy Ramsey was actually a former Miss West Virginia, but I don't really know if that's what's going on. When somebody asks, "Did you commit a murder?" If you didn't do it, why not just say no? What is with all this weird language and talking in circles and bizarre behavior? And what the linguistic experts like to do is they zone in on to a particular point when she says, "John Ramsey didn't do it." I mean, why didn't she say something? "My husband"? She didn't call him John. She addressed him by his full name when they asked about, who committed the crime. "I didn't do it. John Ramsey didn't do it." Now that'd be a very, I mean, I do admit that that's very bizarre behavior, and as I said, she does herself absolutely no favors, and that's one of the reasons why people really began to suspect the Ramseys in the court of public opinion, because they also appeared on television, and they thought Patsy Ramsey's behavior was very odd. She just seemed sleepy and out of touch with reality, not to mention that she was the one who was working with JonBenet in the pageant world, and they revealed a lot of videos of JonBenet's pageantry very early on, and then people are like, "Holy crap, this girl is over-sexualized," and you can see that in a lot of JonBenet's photos, and I think that from a very early point on, it's difficult to talk about because it's so awkward, but she looks like a little girl who is posed as an adult, and some people think that that is just, well, it's going back toward that Lockheed Martin theory. I mean, there really doesn't seem to be a whole lot of stitching together about how exactly a high-ranking executive or maybe even a politician would have committed the crime, and the Ramseys turned a blind eye to it, but anyway, the Ramseys do themselves absolutely no favors. To get to some of your questions and comments here, we had one from Daniel Webster who talked about the knot that was on the garrote, and like, was this something that Burke Ramsey, the son, could have learned about in the Boy Scouts? Daniel Webster says, 9-year-olds cannot be Boy Scouts, but I do know that the Ramseys themselves said Burke had an interest in knot tying, and although it's unlikely, it's not impossible that he would have known about a knot. I like the theory that involves Burke, which is the same thing that I was thinking, except I think that maybe Burke deliberately strangled her. That was a response to that last episode talking about how Burke hit JonBenet Ramsey in the head, and that he used the rope to try and move her body to a different location by tying it around her neck, and that then John Ramsey, the father, altered the rope to make it look more complex, and that was all that he meant by staging the scene. And that the reason why there are those 2 puncture marks on JonBenet's body is that Burke picked up a piece of his toy train set, the train track, and stabbed JonBenet to see if that would wake her up. So that's what he said. But what stood out to me more in that is 9-year-olds cannot be Boy Scouts. And I began to think about that, and because I'm an Eagle Scout myself, and I was like, when exactly did I go from the Cub Scouts to the Boy Scouts? And no, it really is perhaps after the age of 9. I think that it's much closer to 10 or 11. Burke was just shy of his 10th birthday, but what Daniel Webster also says is, I was not into knot tying until I got into the Boy Scouts, which was beyond age 11, and I already asked the knot tying in the Boy Scouts because of sailing, and I could have done that knot at the time. I was an average ordinary 9-year-old, and if I could do it, I would say that Burke Ramsey could have done it, meaning making the knot that was on the garrote. I heavily disputed that in that last episode, saying that, all right, you have a 9-year-old who is just shy of his 10th birthday. Even if Burke knew how to tie knots, you'd have to bear in mind that in full panic mode, he's going to resort to his knot tying knowledge from the Boy Scouts or sailing. I don't think that that would happen. Now, I mean, Burke and I are different people. I don't know exactly how his brain would have functioned, but just that someone is going to immediately resort to those types of instincts, I dispute that. And as you can see, that I do lean toward an intruder being involved. I think the Ramseys are displaying some very odd behavior, but I am definitely not convinced that Burke Ramsey murdered his sister by striking her head in the head with a blunt object over a fight involving a piece of pineapple. And it's just that. It's just what Lou Smith's granddaughter said. Well, that means that somebody got a ding on the head that was too hard, and they thought of a perverted way to cover it up. But as for Michael Helgoth as a suspect, he is looking less and less likely. Now, because this is True Crime Talk Radio, I'm going to be talking about several different subjects, but I would like to remind you guys that you can download this program for free at LaunchPad 1. There's a link to that in the description box. If you would like to download the audio as a pure podcast, you can take it on the go anywhere and anyhow. LaunchPad 1 under the same name, BlackBoxOnlineRadio, but the easiest way to find it is to go over to the description box and click on that link. Okay, so it is now January, and I follow the monthly podcast, Crime After Crime, which I've talked about several times here on this channel. It is hosted by two people whom I think are absolutely excellent true crime YouTubers, and one of them is Danielle Hallen, and she told the story of Jameson Bachmann in their episode for this month, and it was shocking because he had so many elements of someone who would go on to become a serial killer, but instead, he did more things involving real estate fraud. And this guy, Jameson Bachmann, grew up with very overbearing parents, but they also gave him a lot of undeserving praise, where they would just show him off, particularly his mother, pinching his cheeks in front of people and saying, "You're the greatest boy in the world." And it created an overinflated sense of self-image, like an overinflated sense of entitlement, all of that. And he developed a lot of very deviant behaviors. But when I say that he would commit real estate fraud, it's not even so much that, it's that he would take advantage of loopholes in the legal system involving getting other people to pay for his rent. Like he would respond to ads for people looking for roommates, and then he would accuse them of doing unsafe behaviors, like someone left a cigarette in the toilet. He was like, "This place is not safe. I don't have to pay the rent now because this place is not habitable and it's your fault," and always providing some type of explanation about why he doesn't owe money. And he did it from place to place to place to place over and over again. It wasn't simply trying to get back at a roommate who didn't like him very much. He did this numerous times, and it even got to the point where he started doing it to his own brother. And then his brother ended up murdered. And another thing that Danielle Hallen revealed was that Jameson Bachmann, who used many aliases throughout his life, was a person who saw a very traumatic incident when he was in his early university days. At a frat house, he saw someone get beheaded. Someone just pulled out a knife, slit someone's throat, and pulled the head back in front of a group of people, and that he was horribly traumatized by that event, and that just escalated his deviant behavior. And I just saw all of these hallmarks of a serial killer, but the primary focus of their program was just about how he's committing these types of, as I said, you could call it real estate fraud. You could just call it being a jerk who is not paying his rent. And I just thought that it was interesting how his deviant behavior went in that direction, up until the point where his brother ended up murdered, and I was like waiting for the episode to continue, and I was like, well, did he do it? Was he convicted of that? I mean, was he actually the person who did that? And the answer was that Jameson Bachmann committed suicide before he could go to trial, and it's a very, very tragic story, but I don't think that it should be downplayed that witnessing a horrific crime like watching somebody get their throat slit and practically beheaded, just watching that definitely can traumatize someone. And some people might be thinking, well, it would only affect him if it were a person who he was very close to, or it was a family member. No, I think just experiencing that has a very negative effect on someone else's well-being, and the people who are exposed to very heinous acts of violence are more likely to go on to commit violent acts themselves. But this whole serial killer connection should not be downplayed. Serial killer connection meaning he experienced some similar events. It's just his criminal behaviors turned out rather differently. I mean, if he was the prime suspect in his brother's murder, perhaps he did indeed commit another murder that he wasn't charged with, but that would be just guesswork. But with serial killers, what you see is, even sometimes, being exposed to the slaughter of animals and the mistreatment of animals can also affect the brain in a traumatic way. So, it was an absolutely shocking story, though, and you can hear more about this in the Crime After Crime Worst Roommate episode that came out for January of 2022. That story was told by Danielle Hallen, and her co-host of that is John Lorden, the guy I mentioned previously from the Lorden Arts channel, and somebody left a comment recently simply saying that John Lorden is a lazy researcher. He didn't believe the Pizzagate story back when it came out. And I've spoken very highly of John Lorden here on this channel. I followed his stuff daily back when he was doing the show 5 days a week and then 3 days a week. But I just thought that was so surprising because that was one of his episodes on Pizzagate that I've watched multiple times, and to provide somewhat of an introduction, there are those two Washington players, if you will, John and Tony Podesta, and many of their emails were leaked, over 50,000 actually, and some people caught on to something, and they said, hey, wait a second, these guys are talking about pizza way too frequently, and is this a code word for something? And then the internet went crazy and said, cheese pizza on the dark web is code for something that begins with C and something that begins with P. I don't even want to say it on YouTube because you get censored immediately if you talk about that subject. And that these guys are actually involved with some type of organization and syndicate that does very bad things to children, and it was done primarily through the wrongdoings of someone named James Alefantis on the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria, which is a pizzeria that also has ping pong tables, and that somebody actually went to the Comet Ping Pong with a gun, and they held up the place and they said, what's really going on? And Alex Jones was forced to give a public apology, saying that he was wrong about the whole thing. I'm sure you know all about Pizzagate. But they said that he was a lazy researcher, and because he didn't believe Pizzagate. Now, I thought when I read the term that they said that he was a lazy researcher, they were going to call him out on some other things, like a lot of his source material comes from press releases and press conferences put out by law enforcement, and I don't think that's a bad thing to do, but some people do. They think you shouldn't listen to the police. They sometimes say pieces of disinfo to try and bait a killer into behaving in a certain way. They don't always tell the truth. But in that Pizzagate episode that he did, he actually read all 50,000 plus emails that were exchanged between John and Tony Podesta, and his conclusion was really quite surprising, because what he did was he revealed that his day job was being an internet investigator. Like, he would go through data for companies that when they needed to get results and learn information. So his day job was actually in somewhat of that field and category, and he proposed that this whole Pizzagate controversy is actually, these guys are using a code word amongst themselves, two brothers and their assistant, but it's not a code word for CP. It was a code word for something, most likely drug-related, and he even suggested marijuana. Now, some of the examples that he brought up in that episode were when they say these guys are talking about pizza too frequently. It would say, hey, you want to come over for dinner or pizza tomorrow? Dinner or pizza? Doesn't that just sound so weird? Or, like, there was another one when John Podesta was working late, and Tony Podesta says, hey, I heard you're working late. Do you want me to bring you a pizza? And John says, no, I can't. I have too much work to do. No, if he brought him a pizza, wouldn't that save him time? I mean, someone's just bringing it to him. It doesn't mean anything. And there are all kinds of theories about what they were actually talking about. That, firstly, that cheese pizza is the code word for that bad thing involving children. If they're just saying pizza, then that doesn't say anything necessarily to do with children. And one of my friends from the UK told me that in England, I take his word for that, he said that pizza was a code word for a prostitute, and he said that purely unrelated to Pizzagate. He just said pizza is a code word for prostitution, so even if they're not talking about children, I mean, is that something that's going on? And when I did a Pizzagate episode once, someone told me, all right, I don't doubt you in anything that you're saying, that, this isn't exactly how people represented it, but James Alefantis is a very weird individual. Okay, I agree with that. People like Tony Podesta is a very weird individual. Hells yes. I mean, he might actually be up to some very illegal activities involving children. The whole things about collecting weird types of art, keeping stuffed animals near his bedside when he has no kids. But I don't care about any of that. Being weird is not a crime, right? What I care more about is those types of behaviors partnered with the fact that he had personal connections to Dennis Hastert the bastard, the former Speaker of the House, who was involved with what? Uh, Bad things involving children. Again, being careful with my language. But no, just that Pizzagate episode that was done on the Lord and Arts channel is perhaps one of the most thorough investigations into the subject, because it was the way that John Lorden introduced it by saying that, okay, who on earth has actually read all 50,000 plus emails? Was it 51,000 or 57,000 emails? And then John Lorden said, I have. And that was the subject of his episode. And at the time, I really found that a lot of people were just very hesitant to turn down that type of particular theory, because they wanted to get caught up in the mass hysteria of it all, and they didn't want to accept the fact that there could be an alternative. And as I said, his conclusion was not about anything like pizza as a code word for a prostitute. He thought that the odd uses of the word pizza meant that it was their code word for something like light drugs such as marijuana. Because you put that in context, it says, like, okay, you want to come over for dinner or pizza? I guess that would mean that, hey, do you want to get high? If that is the case, that's so much more benign than what people were thinking. But it goes to show you that if the mainstream media does not press at a subject for very long, it will just go right under the carpet. Out of sight, out of mind. And now the next story here on True Crime Talk Radio is one that is even more difficult to talk about. I follow a lot of different true crime cases, and I often like to read about websites from the law, if they're talking about things that have been posted by lawyers and legal analysis. And I was on one that mentioned the name Rancho Cucamonga. And again, I'm a West Virginian. That didn't mean anything to me. And not only that, it was talking about Rancho Cucamonga sex crimes. There was like, if you've been accused of a Rancho Cucamonga sex crime, well, call this lawyer. And I was like, what on earth is that? And the title for this episode was almost, What is a Rancho Cucamonga sex crime? And I decided not to do that because it turns out that, I mean, completely unbeknownst to me, but Rancho Cucamonga is just a city in California, and that particular law office was operating out of California. But they provided a particular link to something that wasn't California related. However, they wanted to share some things about the type of work that they do, and that was dealing with the internet and how that relates to the criminal world. Because in the United States of America, we have the age of consent, right? But it's different for every single state. For example, in California, the age of consent is 18. In West Virginia, where I'm from, it's 16. And in New York, it is 17. In Texas, it is also 17. And the story they shared is that of a man named Aldo Leyva, who is from Texas. Now, Aldo Leyva was a much older individual, and he developed a relationship with a 17-year-old. And she sent him a topless photo where she is naked from the waist up to him, and he was arrested and charged with a sex crime, and he was facing up to 20 years in prison. And both him and the girl were like, now, hey, wait, what's going on? She's 17 years old. That's the age of consent in Texas. But the law functions in a very interlocking way, where if you do something this way, then that could affect you in a different criminal manner. And it's just that. There are different connections among the law, because even though she is 17, and in the state of Texas, she actually has the right to consent to things that are sexually related, she is still a minor by federal standards. She is still recognized as a child by the federal law. And because she took a photo of herself in any naked or lewd way, she took a naked photo of herself, right? The creation of a visual image, whether it's photographic or videographic, crosses the line from being a consensual act of two adults to becoming a pornographic image, even if it was just meant to be exchanged among partners. Again, she can willingly consent to doing things with him, but she can't consent to sending him visual images, and he was charged with child porn. But there are some different layers to the story. Firstly, as far as being an older person, he was 51 at the time, and there's an article about him at cron.com, and teenager and 52-year-old back together after he admits inappropriate relationship. A 52-year-old math tutor will spend 5 years on probation after pleading guilty to having an inappropriate relationship with a student while working at a Sharpstown high school. And, okay, firstly, he's a math tutor. Absolutely inappropriate. Absolutely, no, he shouldn't be crossing lines like that. 51 when he met her, and she was 17 when she sent the photo. The reason why I believe this case has received any type of news coverage at all is just because of the next line here. In one of the more unusual scenes at the Harris County Criminal Courthouse, the student, now 19, sat next to Aldo Leyva in court while he filled out the paperwork admitting his guilt. And that was for receiving the naked image. But she chose to stay in this relationship with him. But this comes into a category of, well, it's like grooming, because you see this time and time again on shows like 2020 and some of the local news stories when a teacher and a student develop a relationship post school years. They just say that she was groomed into this. Usually it's a female being pursued by an older man, but perhaps sometimes it could be the other way around, but they just say that she was groomed into this. Is that what's happening? Yes, but what I found that stood out more is just this odd peculiarity about the law, that, I mean, we have the state laws and the federal laws, and that someone who is 17 cannot consent to sending certain types of images to older people for just that. Once an image is created, it's no longer a consensual act. It's pornography in a minor by federal standards does not have the right to share that type of um, content. But in all fairness, I don't think this is a ridiculous ruling that he gets 5 years of probation for this as opposed to 20 years in jail. I mean, unusual circumstances would come into play. Should he ever work around teenagers again? Hell no. Should he ever work for a school again? Hell no. But I guess they can't put him in jail for the relationship if it is consensual. And based on the particular actions of this one, just keep him away from other kids, I guess, is perhaps the best response. I guess the only challenge question I would have for you guys in this episode is, of course, what do you think about Michael Helgoth as a suspect in the JonBenet Ramsey case? But more importantly, have you ever heard of Rancho Cucamonga, California? That's a big name to say. I'd never heard of that over here in West Virginia. All right, well, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and you can always download the show for free, Amazon.com, Teespring page. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. My email is in the description box, as well as my personal Facebook, and of course, BlackBoxNet88. And I will see you over there on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.